Hi, I'm Heather Peltier with Education Foundations, and welcome to video 3 in our series of Excel for Educators, using pivot tables to set up cross-classroom student intervention groups. This is the third video in a series, and in this series of videos, we cover how to use Microsoft Excel functions like conditional formatting, VLOOKUP, and pivot tables to answer the question, how can I identify grade 5 students for intervention groups in Earth-Space Science based on their performance on a progress monitoring test? If you like this video, please click the thumbs up icon below. In case you missed the first 2 videos in this series, I'll do a quick recap of the activity. We have a group of 5 teachers working together who want to create cross-classroom intervention groups for a total of 110 students. The science progress monitoring test that was administered to the students reports out by domain or subscore level and reports out as low, low average, average, high average, or high. For this activity, we're playing the role of the instructional coach who is helping these teachers decide how best to group these students for the different intervention groups. And we now have one file that we're going to use for building out the pivot tables that will answer these questions. In our earlier videos, we used conditional formatting to identify duplicates based on student ID, and then we used VLOOKUP to combine 2 files, a student teacher assignment file and the student progress monitoring data file. So now we have one master file that we're going to be using for this activity. The file that we're using you'll find linked in the description and is called the pivot table data file. I've opened up the pivot table data file and I'm now going to walk through how you would build out a pivot table to help group your students for intervention groups based on their Earth-Space Science domain scores on a progress monitoring test. So this file contains student ID, last name, first name, grade level, their current science teacher assignment, although remember these are going to be cross-classroom intervention groups, and so students are going to be mixed up and sit to teachers that are teachers other than their currently assigned teacher, and Earth-Space Science Progress Monitoring Test scores. The first thing I'm going to do is click this triangle that's in between the A and the 1, which will highlight all of the cells within my file. In the Excel ribbon, I'm then going to click on Insert, Pivot Table, and I can see that it's grabbed Sheet 1, which is the worksheet that we're in, columns A through F, which is correct. I'm going to make sure that New Worksheet is selected, and I'll hit OK. So now I've built my pivot table, although it doesn't look like anything right now because it has no data in it. I like to keep my Excel worksheets organized, so what I'm going to do is right-click on Sheet 1, select Rename, and I'm going to call this Master Data. I'm going to then click over to Sheet 4, right-click again, select Rename, and I'll call this one Pivot. That just helps me know, as I'm looking at this, where I am in the file. I'm going to click back into my pivot table. And what I'm using for grouping for this activity is their progress monitoring test scores. So we can play with this a little bit, but what I'm going to do here is grab the test scores you can see in the pivot table fields section on the right of my screen. I'm just going to grab it and drag it down into rows. Let's see what that looks like. So now I have my scores of average, high, low, etc. And now what I want to do first is count how many students fell into each category. So I can do this a couple different ways. Basically what I'm doing is looking for something that has a value for every single row. So it can be any cell that I know is not blank. So for example, I could grab science teacher and put that in here. And I can see I have 18 in average, 31 in high average, 10 in high, etc. I can get rid of that, and if I know that every student has a last name, I could do the same thing, and you see I've got the same results here. The most important piece is making sure that any variable that I drag into the values section has a value for every single row so that I'm not missing any kids. One more thing to note here, which is a potential pitfall. Suppose I grab student ID and drag it down into values. Now you can see I get really different numbers. And this is one of the ways that things go wrong here. So there are two ways to fix it. I'll first tell you what it's doing and why this is problematic, and then I'll show you how to fix it. So the first and easiest way to fix it is to just get rid of student ID and bring a different value in. But suppose you want student ID there. I'm going to show you how to change that. So right now what it's doing is student ID is a numeric variable, and it's summing up the student ID. So it's adding all of those numbers together and giving us this crazy value, which has no basis in reality and doesn't help us at all. So I can fix that if I just click on my drop down arrow here, select value field settings, and I'm going to tell it stop summing. Don't sum these numbers. Instead, just count how many student IDs do you have in each category. So I select count, click OK, and now you can see that it looks exactly like the values that I was seeing when I put in last name, first name, etc. So here I have 18 students that had a score of average. I see I've got 11 students that scored low, but I don't necessarily know who those students are, right? It just shows me totals. This is one of the reasons why we named our worksheets, because what we're going to do is we're going to now build out an intervention group worksheet for every one of these groups of students. We said we had 5 teachers. Let's say that we know that we really want to do some intensive intervention work with these students that have a low score here. They've got some substantial misunderstandings, or they're missing some key information, and so they really need some focused intervention work. There were only 11 kids, but that's probably okay because they're going to need lots of individual attention. So if I want to see who these students are, I click into this cell with the number 11, and then I double click. And I can see it's pulled up a brand new worksheet that shows me all of my students who scored low here. It's got their ID, last name, first name, grade level, and who their current teacher assignment is. Now this is helpful because I'm going to need to move these students over into their intervention group. So I wanted to find out who they were currently assigned to so I could send their teacher a note and say, make sure this student on this day goes over to join this particular group. So I'm going to right click on my worksheet. I'm going to rename this one. I'm going to call it my low intervention group. I'm the coach, so I'm making my teacher list. So I add a field for intervention teacher, and all of these students are going to be assigned to Torres. So I type in Torres as the name here. This is the teacher who's going to take this group of students. And I'm going to mouse over here until I get in the bottom right corner that black plus sign, double click, and it populates her name all the way down the rows. So now I've got one intervention group of my low students going to Ms. Torres. I'm going to come back to my pivot table, and let's take a look at this group next, my low average group, because this is a really large number. So I'm going to click in here, and let's double click to bring up our worksheet that has just our low average kids. And I can see I've got 39 students here. So now as the coach and as the teacher group, we're going to have to talk about this group of students and see how we can split these across. I can see when I look at my pivot table that I've only got 18 students in my average group. So I could probably send some of my students over to join the average group. Suppose these are students who are maybe on the higher end of low average, or maybe our teacher who's going to be working with the students who scored average on this progress monitoring test has an activity that could work for these students as well. The pivot table will really facilitate this kind of discussion about the students. So this team of teachers is going to need to sit down with the coach, and we're going to talk and see, of these students, all right, which ones do we want to send over into a different group? Because 39 is just too many for this particular intervention group. So I'm going to put an intervention teacher name here. And I'm going to say these are all going to Craig. So I'm just going to take a moment and type in the name Parker, who will be taking the average students for 10 of the students within this group. So let's say the team of teachers has discussed and they've identified, all right, of these 39 students who scored here, we think that 10 of them could appropriately join the average group for interventions. So I've typed in Parker here. So now what we're going to do is two things. So first is we're going to name this, rename this sheet, low average group. And the second thing is we want to pull these students out. So I'm going to go back to my pivot table, click on my group of 18 students that were average on this progress monitoring test. I'm going to add in my intervention teacher. This is Parker. Populate all the way down, just like I did previously with that black plus sign. I'm going to rename this as my average group. And I'm going to come back into low average. And now these students are spread out. So the easiest way for me to take care of this problem is to go into my Data tab within the Excel ribbon, click on Sort, sort by intervention teacher, say OK. And now my students are showing up at the bottom here. And so I'm just going to grab these rows, highlight them, right click, cut, come over to my average group, click in here, and I'm going to right click again, paste, and there they are. It's not formatted the same way, so I can adjust the formatting if I want by grabbing this little blue icon here and dragging it down, and now it highlights them so that each row is alternately shaded blue, if that's important to me. So I have 3 groups so far. I'm going to come back to my pivot table, and now we have left the average and the high average. So we're going to do the same thing. I can see I've only got 10 students in my high group, and I have 31 in high average. But suppose there are a few students in the high average group who really are ready for some enrichment activities. They don't necessarily need additional practice or reinforcement. They're ready to move on to something of greater cognitive complexity. And so the first thing I'm going to do is build out my high intervention group. So I'll double click on that cell of 10. I'll add my intervention teacher. I'm going to copy that value down. I'm going to rename this. And I'm going to come back into my pivot table one more time and create my high average group, which has 31 students. I'm going to add their intervention teacher. And this is Mr. Granger. But now of these students, let's say that we had worked together with the teachers and we've identified 4 students that are really ready to jump over with that high group and do some additional enrichment activities. So I'm going to grab 4 of these students. I'm going to type in Fincher, which is the name of that high intervention teacher. I'm also going to name this worksheet. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did previously in the Data tab. I'm going to sort. I'm going to sort by intervention teacher. Except because it's easier for me if I can grab the students from the bottom of the file, I'm going to just reverse the sort order. So I'll sort Z to A so that students attached to Fincher will show up on the bottom of this list. There they are. I'm going to do what I did previously, highlight these rows, right click, cut, come over to the high group, right click, paste, and then you see I've got this little symbol here in the bottom right corner, which will let me turn these into the same table shading. So I just drag that down. And now I have my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 intervention groups set up. I can see my student ID, last name, first name of each student. I can see who their current science teacher is, so I know where to pull them from. I can see what their score was on their Earth-Based Science Progress Monitoring Test. And I can also see where they're going to. So which teacher is going to have these students for the intervention. The last thing I want to point out is that over here we had one student who did not have a progress monitoring score at all. The student was an NA. So if we just click over here into this cell and then double click, the student shows up with all the same information except the score you can see is NA. And now here's where the team would just need to discuss and figure out which one of these intervention groups would be most appropriate for her given what they know about her performance in science in the absence of having the test score. And that is how we would use a pivot table to answer the question, how can I identify grade 5 students for intervention groups in Earth-Based Science based on their performance on a progress monitoring test? You can see this is much faster than doing it by hand, and we hope that it saves you time and effort in the work that you're doing with your school, your students, and your teachers. If you like this video and want to learn more about how to use Excel in your role as an educational leader to increase efficiency, we encourage you to check out our online course, Excel for Coaches and Educational Leaders. In this course, we begin with Excel basics like terminology, how to open files. We move into common features such as using conditional formatting to highlight your data and really display it visually. And then we move into more advanced functions like formulas, building pivot tables, merging files, and we also show how to use some of Excel's different graphing features to visually display your data. Every concept that we teach is centered around a guiding question that is a typical question that you might be asking yourself as an educator, and we show how to use Excel to answer these questions and to answer them really efficiently. Our curriculum is spiraling as well, so as we teach each one of the concepts within the course, we incorporate these concepts later in subsequent modules, so you'll see each one revisited and really reinforced as we go through. We'd love to have you join us. Thanks so much for watching this video.